Welcome to the first session for the URPE 50th Anniversary Conference. We're going to get started right away, and I think these guys don't need any more of an introduction from me. So the order is going to be, we'll have Sam is going to go first, Anwar will go second, and Ying Chen is our discussant, and then we'll open up to the floor for discussion. So without further ado.
Is this mic?
That mic is...
Can you hear me in the back?
Yeah, no problem.
The mic's not working.
Some of us don't hear as well as we do.
Good point.
Thanks to URPE for organizing this great event.
Closer. No, it's on, but just bring it closer.
Thanks for organizing this great event. It's just wonderful to be together with so many old friends and also to see so many new faces. I have loved URPE since it began. Even before it began, we knew we needed something like this, and it's great that it's still thriving. If I were to point to a shortcoming of URPE, it would be that while we mounted very serious and I think persuasive critiques of capitalism and sexism and racism, imperialism, and so on, we were not as good at addressing the present and the possible, and in therefore providing activists, people who are trying to cope with the world as it is, with what Andre Gortz called revolutionary reforms. Things that we could advocate in the here and now that would actually change the way the system worked so as to empower people in the future, but also to deliver real benefits in the present. If you would like an example of that shortcoming, it's Herbert Gintis in my book, Schooling in Capitalist America, which many people thought had presented a convincing Marxian critique of the educational system. But many educational practitioners, students and teachers, were disappointed with, rightly, because it said very little about the practice of being, for example, in the teachers' union or being a student activist, about what we could do with the schools right now. I remember shortly after the book came out, Patty Quick raised that objection to me very strongly. Patty, are you here? No. Oh, that's right, she's presenting in the parallel session. Patty kind of hammered me on that, and I thought she was absolutely right. So what I'm going to talk about is what would we do today facing the problems that we have in the world today. Now, these ideas are very tentative. They were developed together with Wendy Carlin, who is the head of the CORE project, which is a new open access introduction to economics, which Wendy and I and a team of a very large number of economists around the globe have produced. Wendy is not here, but her late husband, Andrew Glenn, is fondly remembered by many people in URPE, and we will memorialize him as well as many others of our departed comrades tomorrow night. Now, there isn't any simple story that'll explain the triumph of the neoliberal paradigm in the closing decades of the last centuries. But I think there's some lessons that we should learn, because I've heard from my friends that, well, they won because of their think tanks and their lobbyists and their advertising and so on. That would be a big mistake. Of course, that was part of their victory. But they also made some contributions to economics which were taken up quite widely, both in economics and in the public. Now, you may think, well, what were those new things? What was neo about neoliberalism? It was not the advocacy of unregulated markets. It's a very old idea, and the neoliberals didn't add much to that, nor did they make strong claims about the optimality of unregulated markets. Rather, their claim was quite different. It was that the alternatives are worse. Buchanan, Becker, and the people associated with the neoliberal economic paradigm, their real contribution was to suggest that collective action, either by the state or in civil society, by private or public actors, that should be represented as special interests. And so environmental groups, trade unions, and so on are reduced to the plane of lobbyists and were called special interests. Now, I'm not suggesting that was a persuasive view, but I do think that that's a view that has to be countered. Now, I'm going to propose that we should be thinking today about a new paradigm that could challenge that neoliberal hegemony. Now, there are all kinds of reasons for that. The neoliberal paradigm was in itself a disaster, but it also is implicated in the rise, not only in the US, but in other countries as well, of a kind of mercantilist xenophobia as a set of economic policies that is also, of course, a very serious threat. Now, what would a new paradigm comprise? Well, I've taken a page from what the neoliberals did. Not just a set of economic models and economic policies, but a normative core, a framework that goes beyond the idea that the best you can hope for is an individualistic conception of liberty, as well as essentially so-called free markets. Now, the two truths of the neoliberal paradigm, the acceptance from the old liberal of the essentially unregulated markets as the best way to go, and the new part, that is that when people get together to do anything, it's to be called a special interest. Those two axioms or truths, they were axioms. They weren't results. They were things that people said, and they said over and over again, and people came to accept, and people came to teach them to their, that's what students learn, for example, in intro. Those two ideas don't sit well with modern research in economics. In fact, in the years since the rise of the neoliberal paradigm, I would say economics per se has moved in the other direction. Think about these things. Since the 80s and 90s, it's become obvious to most economists, at least those who are practicing and doing research and so on, that market failure is actually ubiquitous. It's not the exception, it's the norm. And that's because contracts are incomplete in credit markets, labor markets, not markets for knowledge, and so on. So the problem of market failure is not something that is associated with the interface between the biosphere and the economy, or that's associated with impediments to competition. It's absolutely a general phenomenon throughout the economy. So that's the first. And the second is, behavioral economics has taught us that actually people are fairly given to public-spirited actions, generosity, reciprocity, contributions to public good. So the image of the human being that populated the neoliberal paradigm of self-interested and calculating and so on finds very little support in contemporary economics. Now, it also, I think we can say that the research that's been done over the past 20, 30 years, some of it by people within the leftist economic community and others in other parts of the community, and some from very surprising sources of people who we'd be sort of surprised to find out that their research is also contributing now to undermining the neoliberal paradigm. So let's think about the limits of contract and the ubiquitous nature of market failures. The important thing here is that, and here's a surprising contribution to our new knowledge, information is local and scarce. That's a new idea in economics. It's surprising because the models that most people were being taught 20, 30 years ago, information was not a problem. Everybody had the same information, and it was true. Who was the person who really started the ball rolling about information is local and scarce? Hayek, his 1945 paper, which was a critique of central planning. But of course, it was very quickly then, within 5 years, mobilized to point out that the corporation, the leaders of a corporation have exactly the same problem as a central planner because they don't have the information about how hard someone was working or whether the job was really well done. Now, the important thing about this development is not only that it demonstrates that market failures are ubiquitous, labor markets, credit markets, the argument is the same, but think about the firm. The firm within the standard paradigm is a machine transforming inputs into outputs. If you think about the neoclassical paradigm, this machine works more or less mechanically. So there's really no cultural or political aspect of the economy. Abba Lerner famously said in 1972 economics, meaning neoclassical economics, has earned the title Queen of the Social Sciences by choosing solved political problems as its domain. Now, solved political problems means things that are covered in a complete contract. Now, in that world, there's nothing for the exercise of power to be about. Nothing at all. In that world, it is also true that there's nothing for morality, a work ethic, predisposition to tell the truth. All of that is irrelevant, because if everything is in the contract, you don't have to care about whether the person you're interacting with is out to cheat you or dishonest or lazy, because if they don't deliver what's in the contract, you don't pay. Buchanan said this very clearly. He describes buying fruit at a fruit stand in Virginia where he buys fruit, and he says he doesn't care at all about the fruit stand guy. He doesn't care anything about his personality or whatever, but we can transact things because, this is quoting him, we agree on the property rights concerned, which means there's a complete contract in the fruit. If the fruit isn't fruit, well, then he doesn't pay. Now, if you give up this idea, if you give up the idea that the contract is complete, then you open up a cultural and political dimension of the production process which dispenses with this mechanical notion of what the firm and production is like. Now, let's think about the implications of taking seriously what we've learned from behavioral economics. It's taught us that people are not only capable of, but actually given to enjoy. We have neuroscientific evidence of that. Enjoy actually cooperating and engaging in collective action. We've also discovered, I shouldn't say we've discovered, we knew this all along, but economists assumed that it wasn't true, that we're quite limited in our capacities to process information. So we're actually not very good choosers, which is, of course, a big dilemma now for public policy. The view of humanity that comes out of the behavioral economics revolution is a social and civic-minded humanity, human beings engaged in taking meaning in their life from their social relationships with others, and it goes way beyond this individualistic notion of the people populating the neoliberal paradigm. So what are we going to do with this new information? Well, the first thing I want to think about is the following. The same year that Keynes wrote his great book, a book was published called Sweden, the Middle Way. So the middle between what? Well, between central planning over here on the left and the market over here on the right. And there was a line. So think of the state space for public policy as just a line. And then we're going to argue about where on the line you're going to get located. That book, The Middle Way, of course, has resonance in Tony Blair's Third Way. Obviously, Bill Clinton is an example of the ideology and rhetoric of we're going to basically moor the ship of state somewhere between the far shores of the free market and the centrally planned economy. And the debate was about where it should be moored, closer to one shore or to the other. Well, I think we should abandon that view. That's not the state space that we have to operate in. Think of a third dimension down here. I draw it on the board, but I don't really have time. So think of the state space as a triangle. Down here, there's something called community, civil society, private interactions that are neither market nor state. For example, like worker-owned co-ops, or the kidney exchange, or all kinds of communities, neighborhoods, and so on, in which we engage in face-to-face contact, often managing our affairs extraordinarily well, but it doesn't really fall into the realm of either market or state. The names involved in this are many, but I think Lynn Ostrom is the one who popularized this view that we have to take account of that third dimension. Now, if we're going to go beyond this market versus state, we have to think not only about the weakness of the pro-market view, but also the weakness of the other side, which is Hayek was right that states typically lack information that they would need to pursue intelligently, to pursue the kinds of interventionist policies which many on the left have advocated. And the reason why I stress civil society is I think there is an alternative to state involvement which doesn't have some of the downsides of the market, in which people have information about what each other are doing. which allows people to organize and govern their societies well. Now, let's think about how we could actually promote a paradigm which would have the kind of power, rhetorical power, political power, that the neoliberal paradigm had. Well, think about this. They had models, they had interesting models. They had policies consistent with those models, but they had something, and it was propagated very widely, and it was what I call an economic vernacular. The way people talk about the economy. And so let's think about what our vernacular should be, and what are the words that are missing. I want to suggest that there are 4. The first one is power. Power has to be part of how we talk about the economy. Whether we're talking about the power of the modern monopolies, I'll turn to that in a minute, the power of the employer over the worker, the power of the platform over the gig, the Uber driver, and so on. So power has to be a part of our discourse. Trust. Trust has no role in the economic paradigm. You won't find it in a textbook. But obviously, in the areas in which we would like to open up a vibrant civil society, whether it be co-ops, neighborhoods, associations of all kinds, trust is an essential element. We know that trust is important in how people enjoy relating to each other, from experiments, also just from introspection. The idea that you cannot organize a society without trust is an old one. It goes back to Hobbes. Hobbes says without trust there is no contract. He meant there is no interchange. Kenneth Arrow famously said that social values like trust and also ethical values provide us a way of executing exchanges which wouldn't be possible in the absence of trust. And the reason Arrow was saying is because of the absence of contract. A third word we'd have to articulate more is society. Thatcher famously said it didn't exist, and we have to think of now, what are we talking about when we talk about society, and why is it that society is such an awkward term in standard economics? Well, here's an example. Consider the following. I'll do the shopping this afternoon. It'll be less trouble for me than for you. Uh-oh, that is an impermissible statement in neoclassical economics. Why? Because I just compared the utility of me, the trouble it would cause me to do the shopping, with the trouble it would cause you. And that violates the notion that we can only consider ordinal preferences. Now, you may think this is kind of a nerdy point, but ordinal preferences... Oh, you do? You do? You think it's nerdy? Okay. No, I'm going to persuade you it's not. Ordinal preferences destroys society, because it means we cannot make everyday statements in which you're evaluating your well-being in the context of other people's well-being. It destroys the idea that we are a whole, and we make those comparisons routinely. And those who don't make those comparisons are called sociopaths or economists. The last word I want to see as part of this discourse, our vernacular, is innovation. Maybe the bumper sticker for this paradigm would be this. The right wing fails on fairness. The left fails on innovation. And it's unfair. Maybe it's unfair. Some quite left-wing countries do very well in the innovation. But in left-wing thinking, innovation is often not put foremost. That is, we're not really in favor of it. Why are we not in favor of it? Because basically people stand to lose their jobs, and so on and so on. That is, we don't endorse a dynamic economy because we don't have the institutions that protect people from the costs of dynamism. That's going to be on the wrong side of a lot of debates. If you're against innovation, you basically can't really get a hearing. Just like the right is suffering terribly now because they have a very bad position on equality and inequality. So I would like us to take those words and find ways that they fit together in a conversation that can be evocative and engaging to people. That is power, trust, society, and innovation. And now I want to do something that's very practical. When I think about putting together a set of ideas and actually trying to persuade publicly people to follow them, I don't know, in op-eds or in other things, I think, uh-oh, what happens if they ask me X? And I'm going to give you 5 questions, five X's that we don't really have good answers to. Or at least I don't think we have good answers to. Maybe you do. I mean, these are not the 5 most important things. These are the 5 things that we don't have good answers to, and I can't figure out what the answer is. And therefore, they're things we should be talking about, just the way we've always at URPE talked about things that we're trying to figure out. Let's start with an obvious one. How do you do politics in a high-wage economy in a labor surplus world? Okay, that's a real problem. Andrew Glenn, who I already mentioned, was one of the ones who pioneered 20 or 30 years ago the understanding that we're entering a world which is globally integrated. It's a labor surplus world, and the high-wage countries are going to have a huge problem in maintaining high wages in that environment. Now, a huge problem for those of us who are internationalists and do not think that workers or anyone else in the United States or Norway has any more right to a superior living standard than anyone anywhere else in the world. Our nation of birth is an accident of birth, just like our gender or our ethnic group and so on. Now, putting those things together, whether it's immigration policy or trade policy, is something where immigration is much the harder, is very, very difficult because we have to somehow reconcile our commitment to global justice on the one hand and to national self-determination on the other. Those two, democratic national self-determination is a great value until we can have a democratic world society. And those two things seem to be in conflict. I don't know how to deal with this, but I know there are a lot of very interesting work being done on it. One of the things I notice is that the China shock in the United States was associated with huge costs on the communities who were directly hit. And the striking thing about that was people did not move. People didn't move to other places. People didn't change their occupations. The inertia of the individuals hurt by the China shock is really striking. And we should figure out why people were unable to move or didn't move, taking on new occupations. I'm running out of time. I'll tell you what some of the other ones are. Innovation itself is a problem. The great thing about capitalism, maybe I shouldn't start that way. The great thing about capitalism, it's going to get worse before it gets better. The great thing about capitalism is it concentrates the power to make economic decisions in the hands of a very small group of people. Not so good so far, right? It concentrates power in the hands of a very small group of people who are sufficiently rich that they're effectively risk neutral. And that's a good thing for innovation. It's not a good thing for fairness. It's not a good thing for democracy. It's a bad thing for a lot of things. But one of the reasons why capitalism has been such an innovative system is that it concentrates power in the hands of people who don't really fear taking risks. I have all of my professional life advocated worker ownership of firms. And I don't think there are very many trade-offs between equality and efficiency, but there could be a trade-off between equality and innovation, because essentially most of the things we advocate on grounds of egalitarianism and democracy would give decision-making power to people who are less wealthy, whether they be workers or citizens, through planning or through worker ownership. And that will, if not corrected in some way, have a negative effect on the rate of innovation in the society, which is a valuable thing. Now, I think we can solve that problem because we know that, according to Bloomberg, they rank the most innovative countries in the world. The top 10 does not include the United States or the UK, by the way. The United States is 11, and the most recent one, the UK, is 17. The top 10 include almost entirely Nordic countries as well as South Korea. These are the most innovative countries in the world, according to Bloomberg. So we have to think of how that happens. How does it work? Does the welfare state provide a kind of insurance which shields us from risk exposure, thereby letting us take risks in other realms? Maybe that's the case. Okay, I've got 0 minutes, right? Okay. There are some other things. I'll tell you what they are, and I'll just modern monopoly. Don't think General Motors, U.S. Steel. Think Amazon. It's different. It was not a great idea to have a monopoly when it was U.S. Steel. Those were essentially, they charged high prices because of their monopoly status and so on. And antitrust, in the idea of breaking up those firms, was a pretty good idea. Is it a good idea to break up modern monopolies? No, it's not. Economies of scale in those areas are tremendous, and they're a tremendously valuable thing. We want the economies of scale of very large units if those are real economies of scale. If they really are economies of scale, those are natural monopolies. And so therefore we have to develop some idea of either regulation or public ownership. But simply breaking them up isn't going to do the job. It's also true that the standard for anti-monopoly policy in America, and it's widely spread, is harm to consumers. Well, I mean, I'm sorry, it's hard to see that Amazon is harming consumers, or Google and so on. It's harmful to the political process. It may be very harmful to your privacy. There are all kinds of harms that that kind of unregulated power imposes on us. But the fact that it's not imposing price harms on us leads them to escape scrutiny. So we need to address those issues. The other problems that I wish I had time for would be thinking about money. I have more to say about modern monopoly. I think we have to think about robots and the future of work, and in particular, the future of caring work and knowledge-producing work in what I call the weightless economy. And finally, I may be exaggerating here, but for the past 100 years, the trade unions have been essential to the representation of the interests of the working class and less well-off people. In many countries, that is no longer the case. I don't know whether that trend can be reversed. My niece is a trade union organizer. My daughter is a trade union rep in the place she works. That may be reversible or maybe not. If it's not, we have to think of other ways politically of representing the interests of the working class and less well-off people. I think altogether that's a big research agenda. I said I presented very tentatively along with Wendy Carlin, with whom I've worked this out, and now I'm anxious to hear what Anwar has to say.
25 minutes, Eric, you said? 20, 25? Okay, okay. Well,
I'll give you a 5-minute warning.
okay, that's good. It's on, right? Can you hear me? Okay. Well, I'm so happy to see so many people, and so many people I've known for such a long time. So many people I've known for such a long time.
Turn it on.
It's on.
It's on.
No? Okay, closer? Yeah, closer, I see. Okay. It reminds me of what we share in politics and economics, share from the earliest days. I was there at that first meeting. And the importance of pluralism in URPE and on the left in general. But I want to argue that what the term radical in economics should be not just radical in politics, but also in economic theory. And that, the original term radical means going back to the root of the matter. And for me, that means rejecting neoclassical theory, not just in its pure form, but as a point of departure altogether. I had the misfortune of going to Catholic school at an early age, but this gives me a big advantage because I recognize a religious framework when I see one. So we need to, in my opinion, begin from the idea of a radical critique. And what does a critique mean? It doesn't mean a complaint. It means another place to start. And I want to argue that there is such a place. It's been in front of us for a long time, but it's been obscured by the tremendous power that Sam referred to of neoclassical theory, of reducing all our thoughts to within a particular framework. Now, the great thing about URPE is that no one agrees with anyone else. So I want to live up to that grand tradition by disagreeing with Sam. From my point of view, the things we talk about, such as market failure, are not market failures. They're market successes. And that's a very important point, because the idea that it's a failure is like saying that evil came into the world when the snake, who was actually not a snake, by the way, if you went to Catholic school, originally was not a snake, was turned into one because of his politics, so to speak. It's the relentless indoctrination of notions such as perfect competition, rational choice, full employment, general equilibrium, and the particular implication of that is that perfection is internal to capitalism in some ideal form, and therefore we have to look for the real outcomes as externalities. The things we see are external to this perfection. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, but all the bad things are definitely external. So for me, two things, such as market failure I've already mentioned, it's not a failure at all. It's a success, and I want to argue specifically why in a minute. Monopoly. The idea that a monopoly is either present when there's a small number of firms or when the scale is large is part of what I call the quantity theory of competition, which comes from neoclassical theory. None of that is necessary. None of that is true, in my opinion. And if you step outside of the gates of heaven, then you will see that there is another framework. And that framework, as I said, has always been there. So let me just mention what that framework is. I would argue that there are four great economists who derive their understanding of economics from the actual study, not from the idealization and then discovery, precious discovery that people don't behave that way, that firms and life doesn't behave that way, but from the actual study. Adam Smith, we know, and we misrepresent so much in neoclassical theory, but Adam Smith, if you actually read Adam Smith, is about moral foundations, it's about capitalism is doing good and bad. But the most important thing we take away is the idea that there is a ordering mechanism, a turbulent order, not an order visible, but an invisible order, which comes about through the interaction of self-interested beings, that set of interactions that capitalism imposes. And we see this very clearly, by the way. When you see capitalism coming into pre-capitalist societies, you see the deliberate destruction of social relations and structures that interfere with the thing that you're supposed to doing. And all of us, as who've been teaching a long time, have students who are wonderfully progressive or Marxists, and then they join a bank, and the next thing you know, they are Gordon Gekko. That's not an accident. The second one is Ricardo. Ricardo made a strong ordering argument for the structural determination of things, of profits, of rents, of interest, of relative prices. And then, of course, there's Marx. Marx, who takes up the classical tradition but radically transformed it. I mean by radical, meaning putting it in another foundation. And he brings in the ideas of class struggle, alienation, exploitation, imperialism, which doesn't come from an externality. That is an internality, having been brought up in India and Pakistan. That's pretty obvious if you look at the rest of the world. The idea that competition involves firms mutating over time to be bigger and more powerful. And not that it is monopoly as a replacement of competition, which is very popular in the Marxist tradition, but rather as large scale, as an efficiency of competition, as Sam was pointing out. So, and the last is Keynes. Keynes, who emphasized that capitalism, especially in the era of fiat money, has a property, which is the ability to inject purchasing power into the economy at any scale. Endogenous money, by the way, is also in Marx, but the idea that it has, therefore, a new property that comes about, and this idea of effective demand, which is present, by the way, in Marx, but is clearly something that is developed in Keynes. Now, if you look at all of these, the binding feature of these is competition. including Keynes. Keynes rejected the idea that his theory should be made sensible by putting it into the framework of imperfect competition, a framework which was developed by his own followers, Joan Robinson, for instance. Kalecki, when he first formed his theory of aggregate demand, based it on what he called pure competition, not imperfect competition. This idea of imperfect competition, in my opinion, is a theoretical capture by the left, of the left, by neoclassical theory. Because in order to explain the world, you have to look for imperfections. And I want to argue that these are not imperfections. So let me lay out 3 areas in which these alternate ideas come about. I'm making reference here, by the way, to a book which I published in 2016. I was going to bring a copy here, but we couldn't find a cover for it. So the cover is so nice. It's called Capitalism, but the subtitle is Competition, Conflict, and Crises, because the ideas of how capitalism operates, its ordering mechanisms, are exactly that: competition, conflict, and the crises as a reordering and rebalancing mechanism. So, in the book, I try to explain the kinds of patterns we do see. 50% of the book is empirical, and that's what makes it so big in part. But at no point is it necessary to use any reference to what I called hyper-rationality, rational choice, optimization, perfect competition, perfect information, representativations, so-called rational expectations. None of that is necessary to explain the actual empirical patterns. But that doesn't mean that they explain just because they're empirical. It's to show that they fit with underlying propositions. So let me start with micro. Micro has to be based on real behavior. Behavior which involves choice, love and hatred. It's the most bizarre thing that I can imagine is that we portray individuals as being only concerned with their self-interest. I always ask my class, where's your mother in this story? A utility function, as Sam mentioned here, it's a chapter in my new book, a utility function is homo sociopathicus. And then we introduce these things, externality. My God, you care about someone else? That's external. It's ridiculous. It is completely ridiculous that we get captured by these frameworks. And it's not the math. Anybody can do math. It's the math is a representation of this absurd framework. It's the equivalent of Latin being said for the mass. It doesn't make the mass any more sensible. It just makes it seem more mysterious. And so I urge you to look at math that way. I use math myself. I love it, but for what purpose? How do people behave? So from this framework of race and class and gender and conflict and love and hate, people hate each other. We know that. I've been to many URPE conferences, so I know that. You can show that this gives rise, you can use the tools of math, stochastic tools, to show that the average behaves in exactly the same way as neoclassicals say, but not for the reason. Stochastic properties. If I take a group like this, I can see enormous. Every individual is distinct and different. When we go to lunch, we're going to partition down into very few sets, and if, as a group, we're faced with a price rise, some of us are going to not be able to buy it, some will buy less. You have a downward sloping demand curve. This is a very easy proposition to show, by the way, and it was not invented by me, it was invented by Gary Becker. I was Becker's student, and I remember being totally blown away when, after suffering through all this nonsense, he comes up in class and shows, we don't need it. So then why are we doing it? Well, you don't get a Nobel Prize for saying you don't need it. And so he stopped doing that. Competition. What is competition? Well, read Smith, read Marx, read Ricardo, and read Keynes too. Firms set prices. This is not some imperfection. It's what firms do. As Marx says, when you go to a store window, where do you think the prices come from? Firms hang a ticket, he says, on every commodity. It's a price setting. Now, that doesn't mean they have the right to set any prices. So what competition is about is a restriction of the prices they set from other firms, from customers who go around and say, well, maybe I'll buy somewhere else. Firms fight for market share. That is a normal activity of business throughout its history. Firms need to survive, and one of the important mechanisms is that the lower cost firms have a better chance in the warfare that is competition, because they have a better chance of surviving in that. And that means lowering costs becomes absolutely central for the survival of firms. And that lowering of costs has two main dimensions. One is the pushing down of wages and costs in general, looking for raw materials, cheap labor, and this is where the class struggle in production is located. The worker is an obstacle to the firm, especially the wage of the worker, but the length and intensity of the working day. We know from the history of capitalism the enormous, bitter, bloody struggles over the wage and strength and the length of the work and intensity of the working day. There's that wonderful sequence in Charlie Chaplin where he gets caught up in the machine. It's about that. It's about the length and intensity of the working day. So the fight against capital and labor is intrinsic to competition. It's a fight imposed on firms. It's not that firms are selected, people decide to be entrepreneurs because they're really nasty, mean people. It's because they have to do what they do if they're going to survive against others who do the same thing. Now, this leads to a turbulent equalization. That's an important point. The idea that there are no balances or perfect balances, these are equal traps. The balancing comes from overshooting and undershooting. It comes from destruction of and success and failure. It's a biological notion, not the kind of notion we receive from neoclassical economics. So prices are turbulently equalized, but that doesn't mean they have to be equal. It means that the distance between them and the successful price becomes more and more of a threat to their existence. I mean, everybody knows if you sold a computer for $10,000 when everyone else is selling for $2,000, you might find some stupid people. By the way, I went and looked on the website for copies of books, you know, popular books. And I saw books, and this was an article in the New York Times, they're selling for $2,700, though they're available on Amazon for $35. Why is that? And the people were asked, and they said, well, look, we know no one's going to buy this book, but if we get one sale because someone didn't look on Amazon, then we make a lot of money, more money than we would by selling the book for $35 because we have to pay $33 to buy it, and so we make nothing from that. Well, that's how competition works. There will be a few outliers always. That's normal, absolutely normal. Turbulent equalization of profit rates. In the book, I spent a lot of time showing how that works empirically. We decided not to do PowerPoint, so I'm not going to show you that, but please do take a look at the book. All the data in the book is on my website called realecon.org. It's not accidentally called Real Econ. And we have everything, video lectures, all the data that I use is available to you so that you can use it and see whether it's right or wrong, develop it. And the last point is the idea that what dominates capitalism is profit. It's not that markets fail. Markets succeed because they produce profit. That's their primary function. It's not their function to keep the environment clean. It's not their function to provide jobs. It's not their function to provide equality. It's, in fact, all of those opposite effects come about because they follow naturally from profit. It's not the function to maintain the globe. Environmental degradation is a natural and logical outcome of profitability. You remember when Google was founded? The founders said something like, don't be evil. Well, shit, the most evil people in the world today is Google. And how did that happen? They got transformed by their place as a profit-making company. Innovation, Sam mentioned. Innovation, yes. Capitalism is the most powerful society in developing the productivity of labor, innovation. But innovation is good and bad. We forget that the hydrogen bomb was a wonderful innovation, and it had some powerful consequences too. Warfare involves a lot of innovation historically, and no one has been better historically, no society, in doing that, in the destruction of people as capitalism. And of course, destruction of the environment. That is a perfectly well-known property of the system. Robots. Robots are innovation, unless you happen to be a taxi driver. I don't doubt that those of us who teach will be replaced increasingly by robots. I mean, it's not hard. I give this lecture, videotape it, and then they'll play it back through a robot, and people go, oh, the robot's much better. So that'll happen. So where do we go from here? The Keynes part. Keynes emphasizes that investment, private investment, is the primary driver of capitalism. You know, an investment function, the demand function comes from that. But he emphasizes that investment is driven by the difference between profit and the interest rate. Expected profit rate and the interest rate. He calls the expected profit rate the marginal efficiency of capital. It's the rate of return on investment, and the interest rate. Now he has a theory of the interest rate, which is his own specific modification of what I call a subjective theory of the interest rate. There is in the classical tradition an objective theory of the interest rate, which is that banks have to get a normal profit like anything else, and their price, which is the interest rate, reflects the pressure on them to compete across offering products and also to get profitability by entry and exit of firms. But the key thing there people forget about is the profitability part of it. Keynes's arguments can be fitted perfectly well and sensibly into a classical framework. And I call that the classical Keynesian framework or whatever, because it's clear that Keynes's major contribution is in the theory of effective demand. Now, there are implications in this, but let me just mention that in this framework, it's possible to explain the laws of demand and supply, the observed laws, the laws that neoclassical theory takes credit for, the determination of wages and profit rates, including their distribution, which is something people don't often talk about, technical change, relative prices, interest rates, bond and equity prices, exchange rates, terms of trade, balance of trade, growth, unemployment, inflation, and long booms culminating in regular crisis. And all of this, I have a lot of empirical data that I put together with the help of mostly my students. My colleagues never liked what I did, but my students, some of my students did. Without their help, I would not have been able to do it. So I return now to the point I started with. Don't complain that markets don't work. Don't say that information is asymmetric. That's their job to keep information asymmetric. Society always had that. Class always had that. First, ask how it works. Because if you're going to talk about how you want to intervene and you don't understand how it works, then you'll get outcomes you don't like. Let me give you an example. In recent times, the left is coming back. Brazil had progressive government, the two successive Lula governments. They implemented what might be called post-Keynesian policies. Stimulus through fiscal policy, lowering of the interest rate, redistribution of income, and Brazil had a boom for 8 years. And then that boom collapsed, inflation came back, unemployment began to rise, the exchange rate depreciated, balance of trade depreciated. Why was that? Okay, 2 minutes. So I would argue that that's because the Keynesian tradition, as it was picked up and modified or amplified by post-Keynesian and Keynesians themselves, fixated on the short run. But I mean the short run, they said, well, all that stuff, profitability and all that, that's in the long run. In the long run, we're all dead. Well, we are all dead, but not theoretically. We don't have to exist in this kind of amnesia that what happens now has no effect later. A very simple fact comes up in the Brazilian case and in earlier cases, which I'm going to come to end with, which is that if you expand an economy and you succeed in reducing unemployment, workers' wages begin to rise. And a rise in wages is not good for profitability. If the wage rises faster than productivity, so the wage share rises, profit rates fall. Profit rates fall, the incentive for firms to expand or even operate falls, and you get a reversal of these mechanisms. So let me end by pointing to 2 cases where this did not happen. One was Nazi Germany, where they absolutely expanded within 1 year from massive unemployment to full employment. And the other was World War II, when most capitalist countries did the same thing. They expanded massively. They didn't have inflation. They didn't have exchange rate problems. They didn't have unemployment. Why is that? Well, because they separated the fiscal and monetary stimulus from the feedback effects on the market. Hitler and Roosevelt said, okay, interest rate is fixed. Prices are fixed. Wages are fixed. Unemployment's going to disappear, and they were able to make it disappear, but you're not going to allow it to feed back. In the 1970s, they did allow it to feed back, and you got stagnation. You got inflation with stagnation. It's easy to show that that follows from the resituation of Keynesian economics within a classic framework where the two sides are allowed to interact. If you're going to be capitalism, don't pretend that what is bad is external or incidental. It's absolutely central. And if we begin from there, then we can talk about how we can intervene and what the limits are. How does Corbyn intervene? And that's a big question. I'm involved with a group of people who are disagreeing about that, of course. But thinking about that, what do you do when you stimulate? How are you going to intervene? How are you going to make it come about? And of course, it raises the obvious question. Capitalism is not the only human social form that we can imagine. Thank you.
That was great. Why don't you move your chair over?
So Ying can sit,
for today's panel. Ying Chen from the New School for Social Research will be giving us some thoughts on these two presentations. So yeah, what's your point?
I'm afraid we don't disagree enough.
No, that's no problem.
We've got a problem.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm really glad to have this chance to discuss both my former professor and also my current colleague's presentation. I'll be brief with my comments, and then I'll follow with my own questions. So first of all, I would like to second what Anwar was talking about just now, which is that being radical is not just about being radical in politics, but also in economic theory. And I would like to further argue that actually radical in economic theory can reinforce radical politics. So because a thorough analysis of the contradiction of the capitalism today may help us to understand the limits and the crisis of capitalism even more, and sometimes push us towards more radical ideas about what political route that we can take. So to give this one example, Anwar talks a lot about real competition and how capitalists compete to acquire a higher rate of profit, which is a driving force for investment in capitalism. And therefore, if we think about progressive policies such as living wages, of course we should support those progressive policies, and those policies should be welcome, but we should also realize its limits, as it has happened, as it has been evidenced by the crisis in the 70s. Because after all, there's only so much that workers can really ask for, bargain for, under capitalism, when exploitation is not entirely abolished. So if we understand, so now I want to bring in this question of center and periphery countries, because if we understand the problem within the center countries as more of capital's willingness to make compromise with workers, then the problem in the periphery country would be more about not just its willingness, but rather that it's about the capital's capability of making such compromise with labor. So a previous co-authored paper of mine showed that, for example, if workers in China are being paid living wages, then most of the private-owned domestic companies would have negative profitability. So profit rate would go negative. So this empirical finding, I think, consistent with the theoretical statement, also has significant political implication. So it suggests that in semi-periphery and periphery countries, even if capitalists are willing to pay workers, they are willing to build a welfare state or whatever, they are incapable of realizing that goal because they're at a particular position at the global division of labor, and therefore they cannot really accumulate that surplus to the point that they can distribute and make compromise with the workers. So in that sense, if we see the more moderate progressive policies are not really feasible on the material base, then we have to think about what possible political route we have to take. I mean, for people in the global south, for activists in the political south, this kind of analyzing the material condition and evaluating what possible political route people can take is really something that only us, the radical political economists, can contribute, can provide those theories analysis to. So in that sense, when hard data, when empirical evidence rejects this possibility of gradualist path, radical economic theory reinforces radical policies. So that's the first point that I want to make. And the second one is that I think that I agree that being radical and means that we should reject the whole neoclassical framework and to be thorough and radical about criticizing the whole neoliberal regime. But I would also like to argue that radical economics should also advance theories on the alternative economic system, just as Anwar was pointing out towards the end of his talk. And I would like to argue that we need more work on both the theories on socialism and also the history of socialism. Very few students that I've seen, I mean, not only students that I went to grad school with, but also students that I now advise, would actually choose to study alternative economic system as their dissertation topics, even in our radical economics program. And I think this phenomenon has its historical roots, and particularly since the fall of the USSR, when many even among us were convinced that there's no alternative. But today, capitalism is in its severe crisis and shows its limits, and once again, to reinvigorate itself. And as more and more young people become interested in the alternative system, and also as the history of actually existed socialist experiments unfolds, I think just to simply claim that socialism or planning had failed is not sufficient. I think this task to draw lessons from the past to shed light on the future falls on the shoulder of today's radical economist. And just to relate it to what Sam pointed out, co-op as an example. I think Sam emphasized that co-op could be considered as neither central planning nor market. But I would argue that actually co-op itself is not a sustainable existence. As we can learn from the history in Yugoslavia, for example, we would see that co-op, to begin with, co-op has this collective nature, but as long as co-op still needs to compete in the market, then it has to start to, either hire a secondary group of workers or do other things that eventually ruins or undermines and destroys the collective nature to begin with. So in that sense, I think it's still important to bring the terms planning, market, socialism, capitalism into the discussion. And it would be more helpful to use those terminology to understand this kind of middle way or mixed kind of structure, economic structure. But I also want to say that, because I'm actually using Sam's book to teach micro, so I think what Sam emphasized about people's other regarding preferences and also people's concern, not only on the outcome, but also on the process, is a very important and crucial critique to the foundation of neoclassical economics. And it also offers important insights on how institutions and policies should be designed to invoke other regarding motives, therefore to lead to socially desirable outcomes. So here, I would lay out my first question. So usually when we say design policies institution, we are implicitly assuming that we are thinking about reforms under capitalism. However, as both of you have pointed out, capitalism is based on profit-seeking and competition, and has this tendency of atomizing individuals and deepening alienation. And in periphery countries particularly, this whole commodification process is crowding out exactly this kind of other regarding behavior that were once supported or encouraged by different social norms. So in that sense, what are the limits of designing better incentive structure under capitalism? And would it be useful to bring in alternative economic system into the discussion when the underlying economic logic is completely different? So that's the first question. And the second question, I think this is a question that when I was a graduate student, we talk a lot among ourselves, and now I see graduate students in other places also struggling a lot about. That is, how shall we think about this division of labor as radical economists? I mean, there are different ways to do radical economics. Some would focus on maintaining this dialogue with mainstream economists. But the cost you have to pay, that you have to learn their language, you have to learn their methodology, and therefore you need to start with their theory, and therefore you can make arguments to modify or refute their theory. And the alternative approach is to instead construct our own theoretical framework to explain the pressing issues today. The former approach would oftentimes lead to big advancement to the theory itself, but also prove to have very limited improvement of our understanding of the real world. Right? Other regarding preferences, it's not new, right? It's probably new, shocking to students who have been trained in the neoclassical tradition, but if I have students coming from other disciplines, this is nothing new to them. And the later approach runs the risk of being marginalized and completely neglected by the mainstream. So I think both of you have done work in both paths. So could you also comment on the pros and cons of each path and how you would suggest us today, especially the young radical economists, to decide on such division of labor? I have more comments, but I think I'll just leave it to the audience. Thank you.
So why don't we take, I'll ask for like several, here, stay here, yeah, stop. I'll ask for a number of questions that you guys can take them in groups, rather than one at a time.
Yeah, well, or we could answer Ying's
Whichever way.
question. I'll answer the first one, and Anwar, you can answer the second.
Okay. I have people planted in the audience, it's okay.
The question about designing ways of intervening in a capitalist economy, particularly use of incentives, for example, given that we know that people have other regarding and ethical preferences and commitments, how can that be part of how we think about a better organization of existing society? That's a fantastic question. There's a lot to learn from that. And as you know, there's a lot of evidence now that the use of incentives tends to crowd out generous motives, ethical motives, and so on. And some people have interpreted this as a reason not to use incentives. And I think there are many areas in which that's the right conclusion. But I've actually spent a lot of time looking at those experiments and reanalyzing data and so on to see what's going on. Why are people responding negatively to incentives? And the take home from that is that people respond negatively to incentives where the incentives are used to exploit or dominate the target of the incentives. So the problem may not be incentives per se, but rather the unequal, but politically and economically unequal setting in which these incentives are being deployed. Now, I don't think that's the end of the story, but if I had, I like bumper stickers. If I had a bumper sticker, it would say, on this, it would say, there is nothing, almost, wrong with incentives that a respect for people's autonomy and fairness wouldn't fix. So I think we have to think about, I don't come away from this thinking we should reject incentives, but because I can't think of a society working without the use of incentives in some way. But I think we have to focus our attention on the exploitation and domination with which the crowding out phenomenon is so frequently so frequently associated. On the second question about whether or not we should build on an existing paradigm or try to develop a new one, well, you said that Anu and I have done both, and I think doing both is the only thing you can do. The problem with starting out to build your own paradigm without learning the existing paradigm is not that you're going to be dismissed, it's that you're going to be stupid. There's a lot, I mean, you know, Marx read Ricardo very carefully. He thought he would get through it pretty quickly. He actually wrote to his friend Engels, he said, well, I'm reading this, he said, this political economy shit is what he said. I should be through with it in 6 weeks. Well, he spent a lot longer than that on it. And we benefited hugely from the fact that he seriously studied the classical writers. So I don't think, first, I think what is called the mainstream paradigm is more or less moribund. The basic tenets of it having to do with exogenous selfish preferences, all-knowing individuals, complete contracts, and so on, equilibrium of a particularly absurd kind, not the kind that Anwar said, what is it called? Perturbed, what's the equalization you said? Turbulent equalization.
Yeah.
I mean, all of those things are now seen as being things that economists now do. For example, borrowing from physics, the notion of equilibrium and so on. So I think the idea that there is a well-defined and still robust what we call mainstream economics out there is simply false. It's not what's being taught in grad school. And I'm not talking about UMass and New School. I'm talking about all the places. Perfect competition comes in Mascale, Winston, and Green. Which chapter is that? Chapter 9. You get to chapter 9, you've studied all kinds of things that go on in the world, which actually are pretty good, like game theory, strategic interaction, and so on. And they then sort of as a concession say, oh yeah, they have this thing about markets. So I think we lose if we think that there is this unified and vibrant thing called the mainstream, which we're going to be different from. I think we just have to get in there and try to replace it with something that's better. And on that, I completely agree with Anwar. We should look at how the world works. I'll give you an example from my own work. Anu has done exactly what he said. He starts with the way the world works. A long time ago, I decided I wanted to understand how the production process was working in a capitalist economy. But I did something which turned out to be extremely useful for criticizing standard theory, which is, let's say, just make one little assumption. The contract for labor is incomplete, borrowed from Marx. I put that in a model. Tom Weisskopf, David Gordon, and I used that in a lot of econometric work that we did. And it was a way of describing the production process in a non-neoclassical way. Good. It was not a very good way of understanding what really goes on in the workplace. It didn't include anything about the kind of work ethic and the kind of sense of domination, alienation, and so on. It was just a very good critique of existing theory. So I think it was worth doing. But I think if you want to understand what's going on in the economy and want to build a new paradigm, follow Anwar.
Thank you, Sam. That makes you one of 2 followers that I have. Let me speak to the first issue that Ying raised about designing. I brought up in passing the case of Brazil, but I come from a country that is a part of the global south, and I'm very concerned with how capitalism impinges on the world and dominates it, and what we can do to stop it. Now, the middle income countries like Brazil and all that have gone through a phase where now capitalism is in fact the dominant form, and yet they want to escape some of the consequences. And so you need to be concerned about how to escape those consequences. I believe that if you have an alternative framework, then you have some idea of what you can do and what you cannot do. The purpose of theory is not just to guide you towards what you can do, but to tell you what you cannot do. Now, I believe in the law of gravity, and the whole point about being starting off as an aeronautical engineer was that you spend your life going against the law of gravity. But I don't think I can jump off a building just because I don't like the law of gravity. Then it exerts its natural influence. So you have to know limits. That's a very important thing. And I did mention the question of Keynesian policies, fiscal stimulus, which is a big issue now everywhere. It has a powerful and real impact. But if you don't understand when you cross over to the other side, you will not understand what happens later, which is the decline in growth, the fall in profitability, the exchange rate, and all that. And I'm deeply concerned with that. And then the question, Ying's second question, how do we deal with standard theory? Well, I agree that the closer you are to standard theory in your formulation, the better chance you have of being successful in persuading them. But as I said, if I wanted to be a Catholic and just be a good Catholic or a progressive Catholic, there are plenty of wonderful people who do that, by the way, then I would still be a Catholic. I don't believe you're going to be a biologist. You should start with the story of Garden of Eden and then allow for insects and birds and all of that stuff. You got to start somewhere else. And Darwin does not make any reference to the Bible. You know, by the way, that Marx thought himself of doing the same thing, and he dedicated Volume 1 to Darwin, and Darwin said, no way. I don't want to be stuck with that. So the idea of speaking to the world is a little bit tricky. Kepler broke away from the idea of circular motions and a geocentric Earth and found he was completely marginalized. He couldn't get a job. One of the best mathematicians in history couldn't get a job as a math teacher because he was a Protestant. And the Catholic Church controlled all of that. Marx was marginalized. At his funeral, what, there were 12 people? I mean, that's pretty marginal. He's not so marginal anymore, but he's outside the profession. Our profession as economists has systematically and carefully and with money on its side excluded our voices. When we started URPE 50 years ago, that wasn't so true. We could talk to Arrow, we could talk to Baumol, we could talk to Samuelson, but now it is true. Now they laugh when they hear the word Keynes. That's Lucas's famous remark. People titter in embarrassment when they hear the word Keynes. Well, we're not going to persuade them by introducing imperfections to make it seem like Keynes. That has to come from the political structure and the political movement against these ideas. So why do we teach neoclassical? In the New School, we teach neoclassical economics. We say just what Sam said. If you're going to oppose it, you need to know it. But we also teach them not to approach it as a religion, not to approach it as a point of departure. That is, some of us teach that way. Others don't necessarily, but we have a range. Keynes would have been marginalized had it not been for the Great Depression, and Keynes is marginalized now. Should he have been something else? I don't think so. History may have these long cycles. Maybe Keynes will not appear in history, but I think you cannot talk about the 20th century without using the word Keynes if you have any sense of the issues that are central to capitalism. So I urge you, don't be concerned about being marginalized. Fight against being marginalized, but stand somewhere else.
All right, so we have a few minutes for questions here. What I'd like to do is to take a group of questions, maybe 3 or 4, and then turn it over to the panel. I know we're scheduled to end at 9:30.
You know Jim Hightower, the guy from
We
Texas?
started a little
He
bit
has
late,
this
so
expression
we'll
that
run
says,
about
if you don't stand for
5
something,
minutes,
you'll fall
not
for
much longer
anything.
than that.
I like that.
So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 questions raised right here. So Michael, why don't you start?
Remember the URPE rule, you know? Don't just call it a whole bunch of manifestations.
I didn't see anyone with hands raised. Is there a woman?
Mehri Larudi. I have a comment for Sam as a comment for Anwar. Sam, other regarding doesn't just mean that people want to cooperate. It means that if they are mistreated, they will in turn mistreat or retaliate or in some co-ops that has led to the demise of the co-op. William Hinton's book Shen Fan, which is about which talks a lot about co-ops in China about 40, 50 years ago, talks about that. So how does that figure into your story? In terms of rules and contracts, you talked about contracts as if they define the whole relationship, but it's the rules that, the laws that are enforced that also define the relationship, and that what's in the law doesn't have to be in the contract. So the evolution of rules, I think, also makes a difference. So can you comment on that? For Anwar, I've thought for several years that once you write an intro text that explains in a holistic way, what is the implication of what you're saying, it will make a huge difference in the impact that your theory has. And I hope you're doing that, and my question is, are you? And finally, I just want to give a plug for my talk tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. What you mentioned about World War II and what happened to the economy, that's what I'm going to talk about. It doesn't say that in the title of it. Thank
Answer.
Michael Wright from Berkeley, I guess, California. I want to take issue with the approach that both Anwar and Sam have taken here, which is really to argue on the level of abstract theory, different theories, but definitely theory, and to say that, well, we need to push political economy forward. I hesitate to use the word radical anymore because there's a seminar in radical economics that's been going on at Microsoft recently, led by Glenn Weil, who was a co-author with Suresh Naidu, who was one of our best young radical political economists. So radical meaning to the root doesn't mean to the leftist root. It could also have other roots. In Glenn Weil's case, it's property rights. Anyway, what I want to say is that I think capitalism has changed a lot since Marx's time, and that we need to really understand that and take that as a starting point. It is possible for living standards to rise over many, many decades. They have, without destroying profits in quite a few countries. The key is the institutional relationship, not just that's been developed, mediated between labor and capital, but also involving the state. That is a viable model. And there's other maybe kind of analogies that should be done for places like China or India, where real wages have been skyrocketing. It's not the case that there are some inherent limitations. There are limitations, but I think we have to understand them on a more on a level that's more pertinent to the present. And the investment function, profits are really high in the United States now. Real interest rates are very low. Investment is, in the basement, historically. Clearly something is different from just what you'd get from an abstract investment function or a timeless investment function. My concern is with understanding better than we have the logic of class struggle itself, not just the logic of capital. I think that's an underestimated part of how capitalism operates. Marx was struggling with it. I don't think he got as far as people afterwards have. And I would just encourage anyone working in this area to kind of really grapple with where the labor movement is today. It's not much of it in the U.S. is much more progressive, at least from what I see in California. And certainly to have a different relationship to it than we had in the late 1960s, when it was much more of an antagonistic relationship. And that abstract theorizing is looked down upon among people in the labor movement because it seems like it's, where are these people? How does this relate to the struggle, as Anwar alluded to, taxi workers in New York City or home care workers in many places and so forth?
Just keep the questions short. We're running short on time.
I'll try to be really, really brief. Mike Mirapole. Sam, it could be much worse than you even say when you talked about civil society and community interaction. Remember the trends introduced by Bob Putnam in Bowling Alone that was just emphasized in the major column in the New York Times. And Anwar, I want to add a fifth economist to your list, and that's Wesley Clare Mitchell. because he's the guy who regularized the measurement of business cycles, which demonstrates clearly the overshooting and undershooting. And I understand that no graduate student studies Wesley Clare Mitchell anymore, and they goddamn should.
I'm sorry, we're just going to have time for one more question. I hate to end it right here, but we...
David Kotz from UMass Amherst. Sam, you argued that it's now become recognized that people don't just care about their own self-interest, they also care about others. But I think there's a third kind of caring that is necessary to take into account to understand the capitalism and to be able to think about an alternative. And that is caring about a group with which one identifies. There are many behaviors that can't be explained other than as irrational without that. Why people vote in a large-scale election, why workers join strikes. People have multiple identities, class, ethnicity, gender, etc., and they act to advance the interests, as they see it, of groups with which they identify. And I think that's very important in thinking about how a different system could be structured. And then one quick suggestion for the global justice, the very naughty global justice question that you raised. Perhaps the Swedish solidarity wage policy after World War II could be adapted to that, in which for several decades the Swedish labor movement forced on the employers a wage increase for all workers, but the percentage increase was bigger for the lower wage workers than for the higher wage workers, so that over time there was a significant decline in equality, while all parts of the Swedish working class were benefiting from this and they all supported it. That maybe something like that adapted to the global context would work. I wonder what you thought.
All right, so we'll give these guys the last opportunity to respond to this question. We start with Sam.
Thanks for these interesting comments. To Mehreen, first, congratulations. What I'm going to say is we should all fight against marginalization, and you did a good job getting the microphone first. By the way, I'd like to say Mehreen, along with Frank Roosevelt and Rick Edwards and I, just came out with the 4th edition of Understanding Capitalism, which is an example of starting with a completely different framework and providing a new intro to economics. And Mehreen really deserves a lot of credit because she made it into a fantastic and quite new book.
And I have 5 copies for anybody who wants to consider adopting it. I have 5 copies to give out.
The problem of other regarding preferences, and this reflects also what David said, other regarding preferences include things like racial antagonism and the kind of us and the things that David stresses, us and them kinds of preferences include solidarity with the us and hostility towards the them. I mean, that's a very important part of what we've, this is not news, but the behavioral economics has stressed these kind of collective identities. And I don't think it's any mystery that there's nothing particularly good about other regarding preferences when you observe that. But what it does mean is that there is a very strongly felt, in most societies on which we have evidence, desire to be part of a whole and to contribute to it. And that's something that can be exploited in the sense of as a matter of public policy. Michael, I was a little confused by what you said. You said too much abstract theory. I outlined 5 questions which are actually about very practical things, like what to do about the fact that we're a high-wage kind of country in a labor surplus world. That's not very abstract. In fact, it's the kind of thing you're interested in. So I didn't really get it. You said we should study how the class struggle works. That sounds pretty abstract to me. So I'd be with you. I like the abstractions that you were proposing. We should study more the politics and the interaction with the state and politics and class struggle. But I think that has to be done at many levels. But what I was trying to outline is a bunch of very practical questions, like antitrust policy. How do you pursue it in the world in which everything has changed, as you said? It's an entirely different deal dealing with Amazon or Google, Facebook, and so on. The, the other thing you said, Maureen, which is that the legal structure of the interaction between capital and labor or any other is, of course, set by the public sector. That's the legal framework within which the contracts take place. Yes, that is entirely true, and that's an area in which there are battles to be won, and unfortunately in the present also to be lost, and that should be very much on our agenda. I want to say one or two things about what Anwar said. The idea of taking price-setting firms as the standard case is absolutely correct. And by the way, it's as much in Marx, in Hayek, as it is in Marx. So, I mean, the idea of price-taking is an absurd idea. It's very hard to teach, and it doesn't correspond to what we observe out there. But I think maybe I shouldn't go on. Oh, imperfections, absolutely. The idea of imperfections is there's some norm and then we're going to judge imperfections from that, or rigidities and so on. Those things which are called imperfections, that's the way the world works. That's what the theory should be about. And we should teach a price-taking competitive equilibrium as a very special case. That's what we do in this core intro to economics. It's a special case. We just spend a few pages on it. It's interesting, but it's a special case. That's how it should be treated.
Thank you. Let me start with Marilyn's question. I'm not sure I understand what is meant by a more holistic way, but if I misunderstand it, please correct me. But the reason I emphasize an abstract framework is that we all begin from an abstract framework before we begin to do anything else. All the issues of race and gender and imperialism and exploitation come from some abstract framework, even though we think we are reinventing. I hate the phrase rethinking economics because it pretty much means to me that they didn't think it in the first place. And so you do think it. You get it in your training. Why should we start with neoclassical economics? The answer is because that's the dominant thing. The same thing if we lived in a Catholic country, you do have to know what they're talking about. But that's not the same thing as teaching people to think that way and then saying, oh, by the way, I've discovered that they have this imperfection and that, and behavioral economics has discovered that people don't behave the way. It's an absurd way to start. It's a waste of time and energy. So in the framework I'm proposing, for instance, there is a way to explain race and gender expressions in capitalism, the limits put. It's not true that firms simply are nasty people and they are racist. As Howard Botvinnik points out in his book called Persistent Inequality, firms have to react to the reaction of their workers. And workers are frequently racist and sexist. And that is an absolute fact of history, just because Sam pointed out, people are not just other regarding in a benevolent way, they're also other regarding in a malevolent way. We're tribal beings. And if we don't begin from that understanding, then we simply will be shocked to find out the world is what it is. I remember a man in New Jersey who, at the end of September 11th, poured down this wonderful cellar of French wine. A man in New Jersey who, when France refused to join the US in its Iraq adventure, poured his wonderful cellar of French wine down the toilet. Now, that's what I call other regarding preference. I regret that, because if he would have given it to me, I would have gone to his house, but he was making a gesture. Slavery is perfectly sensible. It's very beneficial. It's not just because it's bad for people. It's bad for people has nothing to do with it. It's good for profitability. And we know that from the history of slavery. Michael's question again.
Microphone's off.
Microphone's off. Is it off? No, it's on. Michael's, you can hear me? No, it goes in and out. I don't know what I'm doing wrong here. Michael's question about concrete things. Every theory abstractly started has to deal with the concrete. I mean, if you read Newton, it isn't about apples falling to the earth. It's about gravity, and gravity has many expressions that are concrete, including some that contradict its apparent form. We need to be able to do that. I personally spend a lot of time reading business literature because they care about how the damn system works. And I draw a lot of that material in my book. I mentioned the abstract here because I don't have PowerPoints and all that, but it is an important, I totally agree with you. We need to ground it, however, not in the surprise observation that it's not like neoclassical theory, but try to understand what happens and what limits those happenings. Okay, Michael, Wesley Clare Mitchell, yes. Yes, okay, so investment, the question about investment. You know, it's not true that investment is stagnant and profits are high. Profits are high in the US. US investment is very high in the rest of the world. And so investment is motivated by profitability. It just doesn't have to be in a place where wages are high. The key factor is not real wages, but real wages relative to productivity, the wage share, because that has a direct impact on profitability. Of course, capitalism has raised real wages tremendously, but it's also kept them in check for obvious reasons, and that's a very important point. This point is discussed in Marx a lot, about how the general tendency of the system is a rising profit share, not a falling one. And when it goes into the falling, you get a very visceral reaction. I do a lot in the book about that limit.